Okay, so to open up today, just a reminder, we are recording. Do you guys have any questions up to this point before I start layering additional detailed knowledge of some techniques on you? Do you have any questions? All right, so I will close out that introductory slide. We're going to jump straight into techniques. The techniques that I'll cover with you first are from the very first knowledge area that you covered, which is chapter 3, and that's business analysis, planning, and monitoring. Now, some of this will feel a little bit repetitive because you, when you were with ECBA, you were probably exposed to it, but it was on a very high theoretical level, and it was not as detailed as the BAPM presents it. You know, for example, estimation. You guys learned what estimation is. You probably learned top down, bottom up, things like that. But there are some additional, more complicated elements to estimation that you did not cover, like parametric versus PERT versus things like that. So those are the kind of things that we'll talk about. Yes, it is going to feel a little bit PME, but so does business analysis, planning, and monitoring knowledge area. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and get into the tasks, these techniques. We will repeat some of the theoretical conversation, but then we will layer on top of that the more complexity of the higher complexity of detail for that specific technique. So with estimation, this is when we're trying to do cost benefit. We can't understand the value that a solution might be able to offer if we don't understand what is the effort or what is the cost to implement it, because that's the cost part of cost benefit. And in order to do that, we have to guess, because we don't know what we don't know. We haven't, until we've actually done a thing, we cannot state with certainty how much effort it took. We are always guessing when we're talking about this will take that much time, that will cost this much. Now, cost, licensing, things like that, is probably a closer estimation, but it is still an estimation because things happen. We get a solution and we got the licensing count right, but then we find out that there's a piece of capability that we need that's just a little bit different than what's represented, and we need to spend just a very fractional amount of additional income, or I mean cost, to acquire that add-on, right? So it's still an estimation. Now, I think I mentioned in the last class last weekend when you were with me that we should never say it'll take about 2 months. If I tell someone, oh, this will take about 2 months, what do they hear? Can you guys tell me? I'm sorry, say that one more time. Right. So, well, what they hear, they don't even hear, they hear 2 months. That's all they hear. Yeah. So they as soon as you try to say about, or maybe as much as, or any of the natural language that you speak before you give a date, or before you give a period of time statement, or before you give a dollar amount, they only hear the dollar amount. They only hear the time frame. They only hear, they only hear the metric. Now, if you say it will take anywhere between 1 month and 6 months, well, now I've given you 2 dates. You can choose to still just hear one of them, but it's harder to do that. And it's harder to justify the expectation I built, because that individual will say, well, I gave you a range. And there's a psychological impact as soon as you give a range. It's a lot harder for us to justify only hearing one value when 2 values are provided. It is easier for us to justify the not hearing about, or approximately, or I estimate, or things like that. So we always give a range. And I'll if it's not shown in the slide deck, and I don't think it is because I don't think it's even mentioned in the BABOK, it is something that will help you in real life. Um, did I share with you guys the cone of uncertainty last weekend? I don't think I did. No. Have you guys heard of the cone of uncertainty? I'm not hearing some resounding yes. Huh? No. Okay, so I'm going to share that with you. It gives you a technique by which you can share the ranges of values, where you can justify the range, and where your resources that are consuming estimation from you will accept it better, because it starts narrowing the further along that you get, and so it feels very reasonable. And so I'll share that with you by the end of this if it's not shared in here, and I don't think it is. So you guys talked about the different techniques. We talked about, I believe you probably, I can't remember if I did it with you because I had to cover some techniques, but I think it was probably, Peter. But we have top down, and this is where we look at, okay, we need to do this thing. We are going to look at everything from the top. And this is when I worked at a floral organization, and it wasn't like a local florist shop. It was 1-800-Flowers, Teleflora. It was that kind of a company. And they did take orders for flowers, but their largest business was building software for florists. And the owner of the company went to a conference, and I would expect that some of you can probably relate to this story I'm about to tell. So Bigwig goes to the conference. Here's either existing or potential customers complaining about things that are difficult, things that hurt. This individual gets really, really excited because we're going to solve all those problems for you. We're going to do A through Z, and we're going to do it, and it's, mind you, it's like March, right? We're going to do it by the end of the year. We're going to what? You know, that person comes home, shares this exciting news with the team that's supposed to make it happen. And it's like deer in headlights. You want us to do what in what time? So now we have to figure out how to take this feature set, this set of features that was, quote, sold at the conference. Within this time frame, I have to figure out how to break down all of the capability he just announced we were going to deliver with confidence. And I have to figure out how I'm going to break that down into the next layer and allocate the time for this down into these two, and then allocate the time down into these two. Now what that means, it could be reasonable, but very seldom is it so. Usually what means is we have to figure out what are we not going to do in our environment that we had planned, or what resources am I going to get? Right? This is really hard when you're talking consulting. If you give a bucket of hours of effort that you're going to work and you're going to deliver these capabilities, and what you sell is the feature, you have to figure out how to control your cost and get it delivered in those time frames promised, right? So that's when I'm looking at the high level, just looking really, really high level, and I'm giving you understanding of effort or cost without digging into anything. I'm giving you that. And then later what I do is I break it down. Okay, if I've got this many hours to deliver these features, how am I going to do that? That's top down. Bottom up is a lot more accurate. Bottom up is when we say, okay, these are the features we need to do. And instead of estimating up here and then breaking them down and allocating time, we start with the feature, we figure out what does that mean, we break it down into the components, including things like further analysis for requirements and development and test and development correction and UAT, and we figure out all of that stuff. We take all those tasks down, we break down the tasks, and we break down the features, and we estimate them at the lowest level, and then we add them all up. That's bottom up. That's a lot more accurate. Now, it's not perfect because no estimation is perfect, because estimation is always guessing, always. We're always guessing. Now, if we break it down into the detail and we're giving ourselves, and it doesn't have to take that much time, honestly, it just means that the people that are asking you for these estimates have to be patient and wait. for the estimate, right? And it doesn't mean that we do a ton of work to get the estimate and waste effort. It just means stop and critically think for a minute, and don't, the very first thing you do when you're looking at what are we going to try to build out, the first thing that comes out of us should not be the estimation. The first thing that comes out of us should be collaborative critical thinking to figure out what would this really take, like really intelligently. So that's bottom up. Now, there are different ways you can do that, because top down, bottom up, that's just the direction from which you approach estimation. There are different kinds of estimation you can do. I took it was either a 2 or, huh? Okay. Mm, not necessarily. Only if you're trying to do all of your estimation at the epic level, right? Even when you start doing it, when you start breaking those epics down into your user stories, right? And then you start giving those t-shirt sizes to those user stories are small bits of functionality. To deliver the solution, or like in an iteration, you could have 1 to, I don't know, anywhere to 15 to 20 user stories, depending on the total combined points or the total combined effort that you allow to move into a sprint, right? So you don't estimate your sprint, you estimate all the user stories that are in your sprint, and then that adds up to what your sprint is, right? Now what you're doing though is you're doing a combination of, it's still bottom up, but then what you're doing is you're time boxing, and we'll get into that in a minute. I think time boxing is in here. That's where you say, we need to deliver sprints anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. Our minimum we give ourselves is 2 weeks, because otherwise it's kind of pointless and it's a lot of extra effort for the kind of for delivering value, unless it's a critical element that we need to push, right? Or 4 weeks. We really don't want to wait more than 4 weeks for any sprint. That's typically what I see in Agile. It's anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks. It depends on the team. So then they say, okay, then they go in and they look at their stories and they have their priorities 1 through whatever, because it's prioritized in relative order, which is awesome. And then I look at the top 2 or 3, make sure that I'm considering dependencies, and I say, okay, I need to do a sprint in 2 weeks. Okay, well then stories 1 through 6 are 1 week and are almost 2 weeks, not quite. Okay, well, can 6 be done without 7? Yes, awesome. Then we're going to go to 6. You're still bottom-upping it, because you're still taking the estimates of those individual stories, adding them up to what the total next deliverable will be. And when you're building your backlog, or when you have these high-level epic stories and you're saying, okay, here's my big picture, what I'm trying to accomplish. You don't say at that point, typically, unless you're in a top-down organization that doesn't really understand how to, do change well, then what happens is you have that epic, and it says you're going to deliver all of these user stories in the next year, and then you've got 2 years worth of user stories, right? That's top-down. Agile is still bottom-up, if done right. If done right, it's still bottom up. Does that make sense? You bet. Okay, so different techniques. We have parametric. This is where we say, okay, we've done this before, right? Or you have parametric can be multiple, can be where you have multiple individuals that are giving their estimates, and you come up with estimates that are within reasonable distance of each other. Let me say that. And then you figure out, what's the closest. Okay, so what you would do though typically is parametric is often where been there, done that. We've been there, done that. You've got a group of people that have experienced it before, and they get together and they talk about it, and then they all come up with their own estimates, and you work it out until everyone can agree to an estimate based on historical experience. preferably in your environment, because the work you do in your environment, the effort associated with it is influenced by your environment, by the culture, by the tools, by the, all the things we talked about last weekend. Now, if you've never done this work in your environment, let's say that you're moving to an ERP, as Oracle or SAP or something like that. Your environment's never done that before, but you might have expert resources that have done that before. And then they're still using historical expertise to come up with that, right? So parametric is been there, done that. Rough order of magnitude is, yes. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, and so what happens is you have these people, ideally you have more than one person. One person is fine with parametric, but ideally you have more than one person that has some kind of expertise in it. They get together, they probably have different thoughts on it, they usually do, but they'll eventually come to a concise estimate for you based on history and experience. That's parametric. Now you can combine parametric with voting. And voting is where people don't talk about what their estimates are. They, you talk about what needs to be solved, and then they secretly vote, and then they share with everybody. And then you figure out what's the range, and is it close enough? And if it's too disparate, you get the group to discuss why did you think it was only going to take 4 hours, and you think it's going to take 24 hours. That way, because when you do that, you start uncovering you will start uncovering experiences that aren't necessarily obvious and that people are assuming. And what happens is they learn from each other, and then they come to a much more confident, realistic estimation together. So that's when you mix parametric with voting. Parametric, though, is based on it's based on history. It's based on what you've done before, and based on the capabilities of everybody there and the environment and what you know about this and what you've experienced before. What do we think this is going to take? And whether or not people realize it, that most estimation occurs this way. Okay, rough order of magnitude. This is kind of like that top-down stuff that I talked about. This is when that person goes out there, really doesn't necessarily have a lot of history that he's going off of, no like expertise, but just says, well, based on what I know, this is what I'm guessing. You can even get this from a technical resource. This is when you go to a technical resource and you're like, hey, I know I don't have enough information for you to give me a really confident number, but this is all I got to go on. What do you think? Well, then you can have an experienced person that has history, and they just give you their best guess, and no one's very confident. Okay. Another one is rolling wave. This is the closest thing you will see in this slide deck, and I'll show you cone of uncertainty in a minute, because cone of uncertainty is an excellent approach to getting the range, because this still talks about this doesn't give you an idea of what it looks like to give the range. But so what you do is in the very, very beginning, when you have very little detail, so when you're trying to think further out, the further out you're trying to plan, the less detail you have. So when you're doing that, what you're trying to do is you're trying to understand and refine your estimates as you go. This happens very much in Agile and adaptive. For those of you that have read the Agile extension, you'll know what I'm referring to. Agile, which is iterative and adaptive approaches to implementation, use a rolling wave. Because as we start building out and as we start learning more, we refine our estimates associated with everything. And so most of us live in a combination of parametric and rolling wave. We all do it. The only question is how, sorry, I'm trying to use my mouse and that doesn't work because it's extremely sensitive. So most of us live in those two, even if we don't realize we're living there, and maybe we don't follow the specific technique to a T, but we live them. That's where we live most of the time. Okay, so rolling wave is when I'm able to refine my estimates over time based on increasing detail. Okay. And that's where we say, based on what I know today, now I think this is how long it's going to take us. Okay, based on what I know now, this is what I think it's going to take for the rest of it. So you'll constantly refine it. And based on what you've learned, you try to give an estimate for where you're trying to go, the end goal. Even if you're implementing over time iterations, you're going to estimate what you think the rest it's going to take. So, because in the beginning you say, I think it's going to take us 2 years to implement ERP. Then you know, as you get some iterations under your belt, you're maybe 5 iterations in, and you're like, okay, based on what we've learned, I think it's going to take. I think the total time is going to be a year and 9 months. I think we're going to be done. Let's say you're 6 months in. I think we're going to be done in a year and 3 months, not a year and a half. Or maybe it's, you know what, we're going to be done 2 years from now. It's going to take 2.5, not 2. So as you go through, you'll refine those estimations and you'll set expectations accordingly. We have Delphi. Wideband Delphi. This is what I was referring to when I was talking about voting, right? This is a form of voting. So what you would do is in the very, very beginning, you say, this is what we're going to do. And you have, this is giving you an example of 5 experts. And so what happens with Delphi is someone gets up in front of the room and explains what it is we're trying to accomplish. Once that explanation has been completed, now what we do is we say, okay, everybody, and you give them what's called voting cards, and they all, on their own, without sharing it with anyone yet, they, quote, vote on what they think it will take. And then everyone takes their voting cards and they share it with everybody. They display it. And then everyone discuss, why did you think it was going to take 20 and why did you think it was going to take 36? That's more, that's like 3 working weeks of time difference. Why? So then you have conversation. Everyone starts new on their voting. The next time they vote again, and we're still 23 to 33. That's still 10 days. And that's really, when you're talking about, especially when you're talking about sprints or something like that, that's a bit of a difference. And you need to get it to where you're refined enough to where you're within like a smaller percentage. Like maybe everyone's 10 to 20% off on your high and low end. Okay, that's all right. And then what you do with the end of it is you take this last round, and it could be, maybe you get really close on round 2. Great. You don't have to go through a specific number of rounds. You just repeat this, you discuss it, you vote, you discuss the results, you discuss why is there a disparity. People start educating each other on their perspective, and it can shift perspective. It can help everyone go, oh, you know, I hadn't thought about that, right? And then they vote again. And then if it's still too disparate, they discuss, and then they vote again. And they do that until the band is less wide, until the band is something that is reasonable. And then once that happens, you take in the middle, right? So you go with kind of in the middle of that final range of estimates. So that's Delphi. And it's usually in the real world, it's not called Delphi, it's called what he has here, wideband. It's usually called wideband Delphi. PERT. This is a very, very technical approach to estimation. And it's often the most accurate. Okay, so this is where, and again, this is combined with any other combination. You can do this with parametric, you can do it with Delphi, you can do it with any of those. And then what you do is you say, okay, ideally you're doing a range. This goes directly with cone of uncertainty, so I'm going to pull that up now because it makes sense to pull it up right now. Obviously I search for it at times. Okay, so cone of uncertainty. With cone of uncertain, we don't want to have that there. With cone of uncertainty, this is a good one. Okay, so we're just talking about stuff, and someone says, "Oh, we need to do this thing. We need to do ERP implementation. How long do you think it's going to take?" I think it's going to take about 2 years. Okay, so then we're going to say it's going to take anywhere from 6 months to 8 years. There's my range. Okay, now what you do, this is worst, this is best case, this is worst case, this is most likely. Okay, now you take that with PERT. Okay, I'm going to have to just minimize. So you take that, we had the best case, which was 6 months, right? We had the worst case, which was 8 years, and then we had most likely, which was 2. And now we take those numbers, apply it to this, and that is our PERT value. That is our actual goal date. Now, that goal date is something that a project manager uses in their timeline. When you communicate, you still use the range from this. You still say 6 months to 8 years. Wow, that's like a big range. Why? Well, we haven't even begun understanding which ERP we're going to use. We haven't really begun understanding our processes from the perspective of an ERP conversion. Once we actually start digging into a little bit of that and we understand our current state, pretend approved product definition doesn't say that. This is strategic analysis done. Okay, so this is strategy analysis, this is requirements analysis and design, this is solution design. Okay, so you can say, you know, I'll visit with you again in a couple of months and maybe I can give you a better range after we understand where we are today, where we're trying to go, and what that really means. Oh, okay, so at this point you're giving them a ridiculous range which buys you time as long as you communicate it well. So really, in early phases of requirements or strategy analysis or anything like that, you're really not giving estimates on time. You're not giving estimates because you don't know anything. I'm asking for an investment if you believe this problem is worth solving, right? And then as you go through and as you get, let's say that you're in RAD, now you can say, let's say 0.75 to 1.5. Right? So now you can say, well, the overall project is going to take anywhere from 9 months to, I'm sorry, that would probably be closer to a year, to about a year and a half to, because we said 2, let's go with 1. It's so much easier. It's going to take 9 months to a year and a half once I'm in requirements complete, instead of it's going to take 3 months to 4 years, right? So the more I know, the closer I don't give an actual date until I'm into testing. When you're in testing and it's going well, then you can say, we should be able to push out in 2 weeks. Because you know all you need to know, right? Now that's usually what happens in the very, very front end, even with Agile. Once you get into Agile and you have to do this, this goes away once you're in Agile. This happens when you're in that earlier part of change, when you don't know what you're building, when you don't know the details of what you're trying to solve, and you're trying to even build a backlog. So that's Agile. In my world, I don't do Agile, I don't do Waterfall. We've talked about that. I still do this for every effort I have, but I don't have a predefined 2 to 4 weeks. I just use a backlog, and then I build out the necessary documentation for that specific problem, and I communicate along the way. It might be 2 weeks, it might be 4 weeks, it might be 3 months in my world. It just really depends, but it's definitely incremental implementation with an adaptive viewpoint where I'm constantly doing the whole thing with strategy analysis, requirements analysis. Sometimes it's just user stories, sometimes it's user stories, ERDs, screen mockups, use cases. Depends on the problem, right? And so I do this almost every time, but most organizations that are in Agile, you won't repeat these things over and over. Once you get into Agile, you're not estimating except for on that user story level, and it's so constrained that you're less likely to need to do this level of effort on estimation. Now, where are you going to get the information to help you estimate? So you're going to you're going to look at situations that were similar, right? Analogous is situations. What have we done before that's similar? That's where I was talking about the parametric. It pulls from historical understanding, expertise, ideally in your organization. But it doesn't have to be. You can look at other organizations of similar size, similar culture, similar business function, doing the same kind of change. That's still analogous, but it's outside of your organization, okay? Expert judgment is almost always applied because even if it includes analogous and organization, the people you have right now could be different than the people before. So you still have to take the current business analyst, the current developer, the current vendor, whoever the resources are that are helping implement this change, and they need to give their expert recommendation based on what they know they can do for you. So those are the sources of information you get. Now these sources of information are plugged into any one or combination of the techniques for estimation we just talked about. Yes. 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 Analogous is any situation. Yeah. Analogous is any situation that's similar, whether or not it's in your organization. So analogous situation is so let's say you're doing ERP conversion. It's very unlikely that you're going to have, and then you can find analogous situations in other companies, but you probably won't find your history. Your history goes on top of analogous because your history is an analogous situation, but it's very specific to your culture and your people and how. So you can look at, and even in your organization, you could be in your organization, have done it before, but because of the people, you can't use your organization history. But let's say you're talking about Agile, I believe, or you're the one that asked me about Agile a bit ago, right? Because your voice sounds familiar. Okay, so in Agile, you are almost always going to have analogous with organization as once you hit sprints. Not before you get to that point. Before you get to that point, it's going to still be a lot of guessing. But once you're in those sprints and stuff, you're definitely using a combination of analogous because you've been in those sprints, you're working on the same software, you guys have made these changes or changes very, very, very similar, and it's the same people. But when you start changing the people, let's say that you every 3 years do a requirements tool evaluation, right? So you've done it before. That's organizational history. Other people have done it before, so you could look at theirs. So analogous is similar situation. Organization history is specific. That is specific to the people there with similar work. Okay. So when you're talking about analogous situations, that means that you can find examples that are like it. Organization history is you can find those things specific in this history, specific in this organization. We've done it before with our same people. Well, you can know because the organization history is specific to the team you have and the techniques that you use. Analogous is I've done this kind of project, I've done this kind of initiative. So one is about the work, the other is about the skills, the people, and their specific in the culture, and right? Does that make sense? Yeah. Activity and type of change, people, capability, stuff like that. Okay, and then expert judgment is just expert judgment. And that's why you can have all three of these things can together influence how you leverage those techniques that we just covered. Okay? I don't like estimation, by the way. Just as an aside, it's not fun. It's all about setting expectations when you're really not sure you know what I mean? When you don't know what you don't know, it's really uncomfortable doing that. Okay. And then you got to this is where that range thing comes in, precision and reliability of estimates. So when you're doing the wideband Delphi, that's when you're looking at precision. How close are they to each other? When you've got estimations that are on very far ends of the spectrum, why? Okay, so why is that the case? Uncover what's going on there. Try to get it more precise. Try to get everyone on the same page. Okay, how close estimates are when you look at multiple estimates. That tells you, and that actually tells you if you don't know enough. If you've got people all over the board, that means we don't know enough. And then reliability, or maybe the group together collectively doesn't know enough. Then how reliable is it? If I do wideband Delphi versus versus some others, right? If I try to do, and the BAPM doesn't have all the different things because there are different ways you can go about it. Like I said, I took a whole 2-day class on this and we're covering it in like 25 minutes. Reliability means, you know, if we use other estimation techniques, are we getting the same kind of result? So is everyone on the same page? How precise are we? That tells me how much we know what we're talking about and how much we all understand the thing we're looking at. And then if I do that with other estimation techniques, do I come up with something similar? It's important. So precision and reliability. Now the strengths of estimation, when used well, is it can help us make better decisions. And the more well-rounded, more experienced your team of individuals are that are giving the estimates, the better the estimate will be. And it's better to do it with a group than with an individual. When you have an individual, you are so subject to biases and potentially unmatched experience or expertise. The limitations are, first one is obvious, especially if we don't use ranges. They don't hear estimate, they just hear a date. They just hear a time, right? And if you don't check your work with other approaches, you might not be giving the most realistic idea or understanding of what's expected, and estimations are guesses. It's really, really important that we communicate. We don't know what we don't know. We could be wrong. Humble, transparency, huge in building trust. When you do that and you miss a date or you are incorrect on an estimate, if you have set the expectation that we're guessing here, man, then and when it's wrong and you own it, but you've been humble and transparent the whole time, you are less likely to have a more upset resource. And I don't know about you guys, but when I talk with developers, I always increase it by a minimum of 25%. As humans, we want to please others. As humans, we also want to feel as if we are valuable and good at what we do. And that can cause us to subconsciously, I don't know, I think this is supposed to be subconsciously, we are often subconsciously modifying the estimate because of that. So that's why it's always good to put that buffer. Always put the buffer because that can protect you from, yeah. Any questions or comments about estimation? Okay, now I want you to keep in mind, these two are the limitations in your book. Okay? Unrealistic expectation, single method unrealistic expectation, and can be inaccurate. These two are just reality. They're not necessarily specific, but be aware of the reality because you could get a question that expects you to understand that. Less likely, but possible. Any questions before I move on to the other technique for this knowledge area, and then I give you a break? Okay. All right. Oh, I think that was the, nope, I don't know why that's in there. I think that was the end for, um, give me just one moment. Let me make sure that I have, yeah, I do. We covered, I believe, didn't you guys cover that in, I believe you covered this. Let me show you really quick and just make sure. Did you guys cover this in planning, business analysis, and monitoring 2 weeks ago? Okay, we're going to cover it real quick. It'll take like 5 minutes. Okay, so when you're planning your approach, there's predictive and adaptive. These things in parentheses are only for you to relate to them. They should not be on the test, because when you look at the Agile extension, it takes it even further, and it's predictive and adaptive they shift it actually in the other. So minimize upfront. Focus on predictive is to control risk. Control risk, plan, 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 plan. Sponsor has to approve. Now, this is still kind of the feeling of strategy analysis. Strategy analysis, the big push for strategy analysis, happens before Agile ever kicks in. And then you get very iterative in your implementation. Unless, of course, you're just in a fly-by-the-seat-of-your-pants organization and they don't really do any strategy work. They just decide they want to change something and they start changing. That's also very possible, but it's dangerous. And the difference here is if you're in a truly adaptive environment and not just iterative with Agile, if you're in a truly adaptive environment, what happens is you start predictive and shift to iterative. That's kind of what it is. It's the blend between the two. And in adaptive, you will still do strategy. The BAPM does not recommend you don't do these knowledge areas. What it does recommend is you do them if you're doing adaptive, if you're approaching change adaptively, that you do those things with after you've done your strategy work. When you're getting into the implementation, the iterative implementation of features and capability and value, that you start delivering rapidly, and that you do the high level planning, but then you only do the detailed planning associated with those specific elements in that sprint or in that release that you're planning, and then but keeping in mind the big picture the whole time. Now you will still have to have a sponsor. That I don't know of. I've never been anywhere. I've never been anywhere that the authority to approve the project and the upcoming cost, I still have to have the sponsor approve that. But once that's been approved and I get down into my iterative pushes of detail, once the budget's been approved and the money's been approved and things like that, and I'm getting into the iterative implementation of capability, then I usually have either a business here with adaptive. If you're in Agile, it can be a product owner. It's often a product owner. Maybe the business analyst is performing that role. In other environments that are still adaptive, it might be the business manager, it might be the business analyst, it might be any of those roles. It's usually the business person that's approving requirements and saying, yeah, that looks good to me, but it's just done in really smaller sections. And honestly, culturally, that's better, because now you don't have a business analyst or something like that defining the future for everyone. When you start having that happen, you have a higher risk of rejection of the solution. But if it's the people, if it's a champion of the people that is approving those, right? You define them, you push everything, you're doing the recommendations, you're influencing, you're leading as a business analyst, but the accountability is on that business person. That's where I want to live. Don't know about you, but that's where I'd rather live. In predictive, if you have something really complex, really risky, possibly regulatory compliance stuff, There are some situations where even if you're in an agile world, you have to lean more towards predictive. In adaptive, if you're in a situation where the changes are pretty constrained, no big deal, then you can do adaptive. In my world, even when I live in regulated industry, I start in what people I've always been. I think I've always been a blend before we ever put names to it. Up front, I say, up front, I make sure that I have defined the strategy. We're going where we really need to go. We're being smart and critical about it. We've planned it out from a conceptual perspective, and then but I don't document what does the drop down look like and what does the ERD look like. I haven't done that up front. That's a lot of detail work. I know my my strategy. I know where we're trying to go. I have that really well framed out. Didn't spend forever on it. I'm being smart about it. And now I'm going to take small chunks of that based on the priorities, and I'm going to start implementing value until we can get to that end goal, while I constantly keep in mind that strategy work. So even if you have a complex, high cost of failure, risky thing that's regulated, you can do the upfront planning and then implement adaptively, right? So just going full out adaptive, you don't want to do that at all. If it's complex, critical, high cost of failure stuff that's regulated, could get you fined, get you shut out of business. But if it's something that you've already got something established, or it's something that's not really risky, then you can go straight into adaptive. But I do warn against not doing strategic work. You don't want to do fluff work. You want to make sure that everything you do is appropriate and necessary. High level of detail up front, low level of detail up front. Sometimes low level of detail throughout, which is dangerous, and it's not reusable, and it just so many things that but preferably it's low level of detail up front, but in your iterations you document as appropriate. Requirements change management. If you're in a fully predictive environment, it's highly formalized. It has to go through like a change control board, or it's got a governance committee or something crazy like that. You see that a lot in like insurance companies and places like that. Adaptive is, even when I've worked in that blend, I still, once we have the technology steering committee approve, we're going to go ERP, we're going to implement CRM, we're going to implement asset management. Once they've made that decision, then I start managing all of the change through that prioritized list of requirements, aka a backlog, and change is welcomed. And adaptive in the BABOK, I don't think the BABOK treats adaptive as always time box driven. It just says that it's incremental change, okay? It does not specify this, I don't think. I can verify that for you when we go on a break. All right. Communication in predictive, all kinds of documentation. Sometimes when it's not even necessary, I mean, goodness, right? In adaptive, it's often informal, it's often verbal, and it's frequent. I'm going to go back to this one more time really quick. In some worlds, you will have a formalized process for the upfront change, but then you'll just do this unless you hit a critical issue. If you hit a critical issue that's regulatory in nature or something like that, most organizations like that, even if they're in here, come back to the governance committee for evaluation. But for the most part, you're given freedom. In predictive, communication is formal, documented, like I said. Adaptive is informal, verbal. Sometimes you're going to have a blend. Every one of these you can have a blend. Requirements documentation. In a predictive world, it's more formal. It's lots and lots of documentation. In adaptive, it's done in the iterations. Formal documentation is sometimes done post-implementation for maintenance. Now, if we're doing things right, and it's not in the BABOK, sorry, we will document the necessary amount for development, which is often enough for post-implementation, but all you do is tweak it. Otherwise, you run a higher risk of delivering something that's not truly needed. I mean, we talked about that in most of the tasks in the knowledge areas, is that pictures, 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 right? Um, and if we do that right up front, it doesn't take that much time to document that well, and then you don't have to do it afterwards, and you've gotten better requirements up front. But when you're talking about purity, predictive is formal and ahead of time, adaptive is flexible and throughout. Okay. Emphasis on requirements prioritization. I don't, okay, so in a true full-on predictive, you don't have to prioritize because you're doing all of it. You'll still prioritize, but it's not like a big deal. When you're implementing incrementally or iteratively, you have to have prioritization to know which requirements am I going to focus on next. So that's one element. Task planning, predictive, you figure it out all up front, document it, know everything. In adaptive, you say, I'm not sure what I'm going to document. As soon as we get to those requirements and we evaluate where we are and how complex everything is, I'll figure out what my deliverables should be for you. Okay. And I actually prefer this, but I want it to be truly agile. I want it to be truly adaptive based on what I have to document and share with you. I don't want to be held to a specific, I don't want to be held to, you can only do these 2 techniques of documentation. You can only do this deliverable to tell me the story. That's not fair to me as a business analyst. Some of those stories are really, really, really hard to tell if I don't have freedom on what does that mean? What kind of documentation is most appropriate for me to tell you this story? I'll give you your minimums, but I might need to do more than that. Or we run a higher risk of requirements being incorrect. And guess what? If you tell me specifically what I am and am not allowed to document as deliverables, I will document some risks that you will accept. Sorry. I have some nicknames. Okay, requirements timing. Predictive is all up front. We do everything before a phase, and it's big phases, right? It's not small iterations, it's big phases, and I document everything for that phase all up front. And then at adaptive, I'll have that high level understanding of the requirements, just enough to know what are the priorities, and people will start trying to talk about the data or the how on all of these requirements when you're in these sessions, and nope, table that. That's not for this discussion. We'll talk about that later, right? So, and then when later happens, you start digging into the details of those requirements iteratively. Now that in highly agile, where they don't really dig into that strategy much, you will have a very high, you'll have a higher risk of undo redo and getting requirements wrong, and you don't figure it out until later. If you're doing a little bit more of the blend and you get a good understanding of the requirements from a business perspective and a need perspective, not from a data or a function or a feature perspective down to those details, but then you perform those iteratively while you keep in mind everything else, this is much healthier for organizations. But I still say you be strategic and critical thinking. So when you're talking about the timing of the requirements, all up front, as you go, right? Pretty straightforward, and probably what everyone thinks about. Solution definition, you define all the details, all the screen mockups, all of the data, all of everything up front. In adaptive, you'll have your high-level picture and strategy, hopefully. But whether or not you do, the detail, the solution definition from a detail perspective is done iteratively. Now, when we're talking about this and we're planning our stuff, the things that affect the risk of what we do and how hard what we do is how big is the change. If I'm doing an ERP, I better be doing predictive at first. Do the strategy. Well, okay, so let me rephrase that. I think strategy still belongs in adaptive, and so does the BAPM. But if we are doing something really, really hard, we need to be more critical early on. We need to really think about it, because the bigger the change, the harder our job is. And the harder our job is, the higher the risk of failure. the more stakeholders we have to engage. Usually the size of the change will tell me I have more stakeholders. Every stakeholder I have to engage increases the complexity. You have a higher probability of argument or of disagreement on requirements. You have a higher probability of confusion. You have a higher probability of all kinds of things. But you also have a higher probability of uncovering everything, right? So complexity doesn't mean you should avoid it. It just means be aware of it because it helps you with your estimation and stuff. If you're trying to blend multiple cultures or trying to work over a larger geographical area or a combination of, makes it harder for you to do your job. When you got different kind of people in the room, you have to take that into consideration when you're planning out how you're going to elicit. If you really need a requirements workshop and people are scattered all over the world, that's harder. You either have to get everyone in or you have to have some really cool technology to help you do remote elicitation from multiple people. Because having everyone spread out, having everyone from different cultures makes it really difficult for you to gamify things easily. Collaboration is a lot easier when you're together and understand each other. So it's your job as the business analyst to make it happen. So culture and geography can make your job harder. How many people, how many business areas, how many systems, size of the change is also is associated with that. Technological competencies. You don't have to be highly technologically competent for a specific change, but you have to have resources available to you that are, or you have higher risk. And it's harder to get the right detail. Your level of experience and domain knowledge. It can be too much, it can be too little. This is where the Goldilocks effect comes in. It's important that you have enough domain knowledge to ask good questions, but not so much that you make assumptions and fail to ask because it just feels natural and you just kind of know what we need to do. As soon as you've done that, you're starting to lose innovation, and you could solve surface needs because you're too close to it and you're too biased. But if you're too far away from it, you won't know the kind of probing questions to ask unless you're just super curious and have read a little bit about it, right? Your experience level is going to affect how risky it is. If you are trying to do an ERP, but you don't have much experience as a business analyst, you have some high risk. Okay? If you're really, really experienced in trying to do a report, again, you actually have risk because you're probably going to be bored and you're more likely to not even realize that you're trying to rush it through. Stakeholders' experience in communicating requirements. If you've got people that don't know what it's like working with a business analyst, you have to teach them. Teaching them can be hard, it can be frustrating, it increases risk. If people are resistant, they're probably not going to tell you everything, your risk increases. Your job gets harder because if they're negative about it, now you have to help figure out, now you got to be the psychologist on top of everything else. You got to figure out, why are they resistant? What are they scared of? What do they not like? I just filtered some stuff for you. Okay. And then how much time are you given? In most environments, particularly early in a project, the BA is often not given enough time. We're often not given enough time throughout the whole darn thing. But time allocated to BA activities. What they don't realize is, you know, that, like I said before, you have to spend money to make money. You have to give the business analyst time so you can save it later. But this is so hard for people to realize. You need to save now so your money can make money for you so you can retire later more comfortably. We are so many of us. Business analysts are often less likely like this though, because we think different. Often we think differently. But the majority of people we're working around, they're thinking about, I hurt right now. I'm dealing with this thing right now, this thing right in front of me, and that's what I'm looking at. It's hard to be willing to sacrifice now to make a better gain later. It's really hard for a lot of people to see that. So unfortunately, it's also you as the business analyst. You need to be your own champion. You got to be willing to ask for the time, and you got to be willing to tell people when they're not giving you enough of it and why. And you got to be able to tell that story in a way that they can accept it. But as soon as if someone comes to us and says, I have this thing, I need you to get it done in a week, and you know it's going to take 4 weeks, but you don't say anything about that, are you part of the problem? Yes. It's just like with my career and my life. I'm a people pleaser. And for many, 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 many years, I just accepted everything. And I would get so frustrated, but I would be scared to say anything. And over time, as this company stole me, and then this company stole me, and then this company stole me, and I'm looking back going, wow, I mean, if that place had figured it out, I'd still be there and things would be much different, right? Okay, well, if I never tell them, they can't figure it out. Well, they really should have, what I'm talking about. But I'm just as much of the problem. So we have to ask for our time. We have to champion what we need so that we can manage these risks well, so that we can set good expectations, so we can deliver value now that pays back exponentially later. So we have to ask people for patience. And in this world, asking for patience is hard to do. Any questions about those elements of BA planning and monitoring before I give you a break? Oh, that's a very, very broad question. I mean, I would need more. Yeah, yeah. But I mean, depends on the complexity. You could have a year-long project that's just a lot of small efforts and it's not hard, right? But what I would say is on any given effort, a, at least 20 to 25% of the total effort is the business analyst, at least. On really complex efforts, if you look at the overall timeline, it would probably be closer to 40%, maybe even 50 in some cases. Right, right, exactly. Yes. Yep, you bet. Yeah, when I had a team of business analysts, I was known for my willingness to fight for them getting what they needed. Okay.